Hello, Internet, and welcome to episode 30 of the Braindrizzle podcast. With us this week is Andrea Stocco from the brain-to-brain interface research that we talked about a few episodes ago. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrea.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, obviously we covered it on the podcast briefly, but you can probably do a much better job of describing it. So could you sort of briefly describe the experiment?
Yeah, sure. The goal of the experiment was to see whether it was possible to transfer a very simple brain signal directly from one brain to another. In this particular case, the brain signal was extracted from a person who was watching a video game, and the brain signal consisted in the intention to move the right hand. An EEG machine was recording the brain signals. A computer connected to the EEG machine was detecting the particular brain patterns that corresponded to the intention to move the right hand. And it was sending a signal to a second computer in a different part of the university that was controlling a transcranial magnetic stimulation device, which was then recreating the signal pretty much over the head of a second person who was then moving the right hand. By using this kind of complicated system to transmit the signals from brain to brain, the two people were able to play together in real time a video game, even if the first person had no keyboard and the second person could not see the screen. But together, the two brains with only partial information could coordinate in such a way that the video game could be played.
Now, that, to me, is amazing. Like, it seems like something that should not happen on Earth in the present.
Right.
Now, I know you've probably been asked this a million times, but if I'm not mistaken, you were the one controlled by the magnetic stimulation.
Yes, that is correct.
What did it feel like, and was it as unsettling as it sounds?
It didn't feel actually anything special. So it took me a while to realize what was going on, because in the specific conditions that were designed, I could not see the screen because the screen was literally on my back. And I could not hear the noise that the machine or the computers were making because I had noise cancellation earphones. And I was playing music from my phone. So I could barely notice that my hand was moving, and I noticed only because it's impossible to generate such a movement of the entire hand without not noticing that your muscles are moving. But I realized that the experiment was working only because I could see my colleagues smiling when they saw my hand move. And it didn't feel actually any different when you have a twitch, an eye twitch or a little tick. You can see like you finger or your eyelid moving without you having the intention to move it, but it doesn't feel neither painful nor bizarre. In fact, actually, it was way smoother than that because I had no muscle tension. It's only afterwards, realizing what was happening, that I thought, wow, that was quite amazing. Rajesh was controlling my own hand. Rajesh was my colleague who was actually on the EEG side. He was brain number one.
I see. And so you said it felt like a nervous tick. I'm curious, at any point in the experiment, did you attempt to consciously control, prevent the movement?
No. In fact, part of my job during the preparation was just to be relaxed. Part of the condition for this experiment was that we had to calibrate by hand, as part of the safety procedures, the stimulation threshold for the machine that was giving me the signal, so that it was just barely enough to actually control my hand. If I were tense, or if I was trying to mentally counteract the movement, I'm not sure I would have been able to completely counteract it, but I would have been able to mess it up in such a way that my hand would have not landed on the keyboard. So I was trying to be as relaxed as possible.
I see. So a question I was wondering when I read the article, it says that you obviously, as you said, you had to calibrate the magnetic stimulation. How precise can you position that stimulation? Like, did the researchers know it would make your hand press the spacebar specifically, or did you just know that it would do something with hand movement? Like, how specific could you stimulate the brain to initiate motor control?
That is a really good question. It's quite complicated, and the bottom answer is that nobody has really tried to use the transcranial magnetic stimulation device to control hand movements precisely. So it is typically used only to produce very coarse muscle potential and is used only for medical application, essentially to record if the transmission of the signals from the brain to the motor neurons is going okay. Or on the opposite, it can be used to block the activity of certain parts of the brain. So we did a lot of basically exploration to discover how fine we could control some movements. And it turns out that we can control quite precisely what we want. We can move the fingers independently, but we cannot give a very precise direction to the movement. So if moving the hands or the fingers up and down over a keyboard is okay, but if for instance, we wanted to control the hand to grab something or to move around the keyboard and hit a precise location, that would have not been possible with this kind of apparatus, mainly because those movements required ongoing stimulation for a certain amount of time to continuously check and control the various muscles in a way that we just simply don't have the equipment to do right now.
That makes sense. Another thought that occurred to me, I'm assuming the fact that Rajesh was thinking about moving his hand and that it made you move your hand was somewhat arbitrary in that I suppose you could have theoretically made any signal in his brain result in any other signal in your brain, depending on what the software chose to recognize. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that happens precisely because there is an interface of software in between. And what the software does is just create a map between the signals that you record and deciding what to do with the signal. So it would have been perfectly possible to do something like Rajesh decides to move the leg, and the leg moves my hand, and it would have worked. Yeah. In fact, another experiment was conducted just a few weeks before ours. In this experiment, researchers tried to deliver a signal from a human brain to a rat brain. And what they decided to do was just to stimulate with flashes of light a person and record the response of the brain to flashes of light so that it could transmit a signal that would move a rat's tail. Technically, the procedure is very much the same. What makes our experiment different was that we decided to calibrate so the two signals would end up being the same. And this would give us the opportunity also to play a video game, in this case, in a natural way. Rajesh was thinking about doing what a person would do when he's playing the game, and he was actually just doing it with my part of the brain that controls the body. In the long term, when it will be possible to extract patterns of activation that are more complex and encode more information from a person's brain, it will be just easier to transmit the pattern directly rather than create very complicated tables that associate arbitrary patterns to other arbitrary patterns.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into the future, but I am curious. Obviously, you've mentioned other groups doing sort of human to mice brain, and there have been other experiments with mice to mice interfaces. I'm curious, what did the group you're involved in do mainly before this initial experiment, or has it mostly just been preparation for this?
This experiment was actually our complete first foray into the brain-to-brain research. Strange enough, we had been doing separate research on the two components. So in the lab where I work on, me and most of the research was actually done by my wife on transcranial magnetic stimulation. So we were using this technology to control the signals that were delivered to the brain. Rajesh, on the other side of campus, have done some amazing work on decoding EEG data to control, for instance, software on a laptop. And it was just over discussions that began for a completely unrelated reason that Rajesh one day asked me like, "Hey, would it be possible to put the two things together?" And I said, "You know what? That's a really great idea. Let's do it, and let's try to see if we can actually create a complete brain-to-brain interface using these two technologies."
Yeah, it's funny because I think, and when I think about it, again, the two areas of research that you've mentioned have been done to a certain extent before, so I am very surprised that no one had ever thought about putting them together like this.
We were very surprised as well. And because of this, we actually had no idea how well it would work and what would be required. That's the reason why we started exploring the precision with which the TMS could be used to control motor movements and the feasibility of this experiment. But we are constantly wondering whether we are just doing something that people have done in the past or that people will come up with the same experiment in the next week or so. Also, for the past year or so, we are actually working overtime to this experiment. This experiment was not directly funded by any agency. It was something we were doing in the evenings and during the summer. The only funding was used to pay actually one of Rajesh's students, who is a graduate student in his lab. And that was pretty much the only resources we had available. So we're kind of like a little bit in fear that we're going to get scooped any moment.
Well, I imagine that after the success of this experiment, that some people have come out, and you may have access to more resources in the future. Or at least that's what I hope.
We hope as well. We actually haven't prepared any proposal for more research yet because we're still collecting data to extend the procedure to other people and to more complex information. What I want to do is to prepare a complete publication that contains all the data and information for other researchers to try, and we hope to get it done by the end of the month.
Wow, it's really awesome. Since that initial experiment with you and Rajesh, has there been any other attempts, or has it just been going over and preparing the data?
We actually haven't had the opportunity to do anything after the single experiment for a technical reason. And the reason is that soon after the pilot, Rajesh had to go to Japan for a conference. And then when we came back, we had to move the TMS lab to a different building. But because it was the end of the summer, the building was actually lagging behind in construction, and the electrical circuit, the supposed TMS, was not ready. So since that experiment, we really hadn't had the opportunity to do any other pilot or collect any other data. Also, the next phase would require collecting data from participants that are different than me or Rajesh to see how portable this technology is in general.
Right.
And the university hadn't given the permission yet to conduct the same procedure on other participants. We're still waiting for the approval of the ethics committee.
Now, I am curious, Andrea, in a future experiment, are you going to control Rajesh just to make things even, or?
Yeah, actually, that's the current joke because we are kind of forced to use this setup where I was on the TMS and Rajesh was on the EEG side because that was the condition for the university to let us test the procedure, that I was going to be responsible for everything on the TMS side, including being the subject, and Rajesh was going to be responsible for everything on the EEG side. However, soon after the experiment, I realized that Rajesh was actually in a much more comfortable position than I was. And since then, I've been insisting that we should switch for the next set of experiments.
Well, I imagine that's going to be a bit of a different scenario.
Yes, we probably do different tasks and different type of information.
That's really cool. So obviously, I realize you're probably just in between things and planning, but sort of, should you give us an idea of what the next few experiments might involve?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We have three obvious directions that we're trying to pursue immediately. One is actually try to replicate the procedure on other participants. Because this time it worked very well, but we used two guinea pigs, me and Rajesh, for whom, we have been using our brains for the separate procedures before, and so I knew exactly my stimulation parameters. Chantal, who is the other researcher, was in the TMS lab, knew exactly where to position the coil and how to get my hand movement. And people working at Rajesh's lab have been using Rajesh's brain to decode the EEG time for a while. We want to see what would happen if we look at the participants. We have no idea. We have no idea if the EEG signal would be exactly as clear in every participant. And we don't know if other participants' brain are so easily stimulated as mine and so easy to control. Another scenario that we are working on is to actually try to transmit more complex signals. And right now we are thinking that a good candidate would be simple sensor information like visual or auditory information. And of course, the most important goal, which we plan to do a few months down the road, would be actually to have a system that somehow is bidirectional, where signals can be transmitted from Rajesh to me and back from me to Rajesh, so that we can close the loop. That requires some major upgrade in the setup. But we believe that with a little bit of our work and, of course, a little bit of funding, we can get it done.
Are there technical challenges with that other than the software? Like, would the magnetic stimulation interfere with the EEG device, or is that just sort of a matter of putting one on top of the other?
There are special systems, there are special EEG systems that are designed to be safe with TMS.
Okay.
And TMS is always a bit of a pain because it generates this quick, rapid, but powerful magnetic field. But people have been using it with EEG, and people have been using TMS in the fMRI scanner, which is even more complicated because it requires generating a magnetic field within a magnetic field. But there are ways to work around it, and essentially the ways are usually include the fact that TMS magnetic field is really fast. It lasts less than 1 millisecond, and in the worst case scenario, you can just suspend the acquisition of data during the millisecond in which you have the artifact induced by TMS. So it's not a major challenge. It just requires some proper equipment and a proper way to manipulate the equipment so it doesn't interfere. We don't know currently whether TMS would be the best way to proceed with these experiments in the future. It's a very complicated way to stimulate the brain because it requires lots of electricity, lots of power, and is not the most precise way to stimulate a particular area.
I guess if you were obviously this couldn't work with humans, but if you're doing human to animal, you could try optogenetics, but it seems like magnetic stimulation is one of the only ways to non-invasively stimulate the brain.
Yeah, it's the only commercially available technology that we have right now to non-invasively stimulate the human brain. Optogenetics is a wonderful thing to do with rats, but clearly is currently out of the question with humans, even more so than simple electrodes.
Before I get into some of my questions and sort of let Jack have questions, because I've been talking my head off, if you ever need any volunteers and you want to see how a physically disabled person uses this kind of technology, I will drive down to Seattle in no time.
Oh, well, thank you. We keep that in mind, actually. We're looking for volunteers, actually.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm in.
Okay. It's actually an interesting response because most people actually were pretty scared about the procedure when we were first talking about it. And so we were wondering whether we would ever be able to find volunteers besides me and Rajesh. I'm glad to know that at least there are some brave people like you.
Well, and actually, this brings me to Jack. Obviously, I don't think she'd be able to make it to Seattle, but if I volunteer to be a controller, she'll volunteer to be the controlled. Isn't that right, Jack?
Yeah, I have absolutely no problem with any of this stuff. My favorite comic book is Transmetropolitan, so quite frankly, it turns me on.
That is wonderful. Okay, I will definitely follow up with you as soon as we have the go from the university.
Oh, really? That's like really cool. Because I don't think I would be able to do much if I was being controlled, but I think I have a strong will if that makes any difference.
I actually don't know. Rajesh is the expert on what makes a good EEG brain versus a bad EEG brain. I only know there are people whose signal is way easier to read than others. But on the same side, there are people whose threshold for stimulation is way lower than others.
Well, it'd be interesting to find that out. So I have obviously a bunch of crazy hypothetical questions, but let's start with Jack's crazy hypothetical questions.
Okay, my crazy hypothetical questions. Let's say that this technology reaches its natural conclusion. How exactly would a supervillain go about implementing it?
Oh, that is a really interesting question. We don't know whether it's actually even feasible to use it in a supervillain mode, because what we were thinking when we began doing this experiment, we're like, how could I really use it for evil if I wanted to? Because that was one of the ethical considerations. So as of now, the limitation are that we can do very little, and the participants need to be willing, because there's no way you can trick a participant to sit on a kind of a dentist chair and place a TMS coil over his head without the person noticing. So the two problems to resolve are find a way to stimulate the participant's brain, the person's brain, without the person's knowing, and most importantly, reach a level of control of the stimulator delivered to the brain, such that we can actually force this person to do it. Now, suppose we have solved the second problem. Suppose that we have reached a technological level that we know exactly which neurons to stimulate. To solve the first problem, as far as I see it, there are only two solutions. The first one is to find a way to control signals, electrical and magnetic signals, that are delivered to the brain remotely. And we don't know how to do it. The second one would be to implant something into the person's brain without the person knowing, maybe because with the excuse of a medical procedure. But even if the second procedure is applied, you will need to actually implant a complete neural net, something that would connect to a vast amount of neurons to actually have any effect.
Mm.
And when we examine all the scenarios, we realize that actually the possibilities of using this for evil are quite limited, unless the technological gap, the technological progress is just actually a technological leap more than a steady increase in progress.
I see. By the way, in addition to volunteering, I would also volunteer in your ethical discussions, because I have so many ways to use this for evil. Like, it's... So, I mean, well, for one, I imagine down the road it would be technically possible to construct some sort of helmet with an array of magnetic coils to sort of stimulate various regions of the brain simultaneously.
Yes.
So if you could, like, disable someone enough to get a helmet on them, they wouldn't be able to take it off.
Oh, that's a good point. So your point is that if I put an helmet on a person, then I can control his body or his mind, well, I can prevent him from taking the helmet off. Exactly. That's a really good point. Yes, I guess that in theory that is possible. Stimulation helmets. Well, you actually reach a scenario that we didn't think about.
See?
So you officially won the Supervillain prize.
Oh, I'm so happy right now. You have no idea. Also, a human controlling animals for various means, which you could control way more directly using optogenetics instead of controlling humans.
Yes, that is actually the immediate, probably quote evil application of this technology. And in fact, that is why there was the initial research that was done on animals, because with animals you can reach immediately a level of precision in delivering the stimulation that is unthinkable in the case of humans, mostly because you have access actually to the animal's brain.
Mm-hmm.
And because animals don't really complain, you can implant as many electrodes and as many systems of stimulation as you want.
Exactly.
This, in fact, was the kind of research that was financed by the army. I was saying, in fact, actually, in many cases, you probably don't even need to have, although it's convenient, you don't even probably need a person to control the animal. Once you have implanted enough these electrodes in the animal's brain, everything can be completely directed by a properly programmed computer.
That's true, but I'm thinking like a snake with a camera on it, so you can like be the snake.
Oh, yes, that again brings you back to the bidirectional system, where you not only control an animal, but actually you want actually to see what the animal sees, and act. Yes.
So yeah, I can be a volunteer for control and part of your supervillain think tank if you need it.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think that's a pretty good high note, unless Jack, you have any other questions.
Just more nagging and doom-mongering about skinwalkers.
Yeah, she's scared of skinwalkers. But I mean, again, I am super excited about this research. All joking aside, I do think it's going to be awesome. And again, I am serious about volunteering. And hopefully, once you guys get going again, we can have you back on the podcast and talk more about it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'll let you know when the final data is published, and then we can do another podcast. I will be happy to.
Oh, and bring up my Hamlet idea, because I think that has potential.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it was really awesome talking to you, Andrea.
Oh, thanks. It was really fun to do this podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for making the myths a reality.
Oh, thanks.
So we'll cut it there, and then that should be up this Sunday.
Okay, perfect. Do I find it on iTunes?